I'll be reading from Matthew 7, verses 1 to 6. Do not judge, so that you may not be judged. For the judgment you give will be the judgment you get, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbor, let me take the speck out of your eye, while the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. Do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them underfoot and turn and maul you. The word of the Lord.
I gave you a good passage for your first reading at FaithWorks. Larry, well done. Always entertaining to end on a note of mauling by dogs. So in preparation for this teaching time, I admit I might have spent just a little bit of time Googling judgmental cats, because that's a thing. People take pictures of their cats in particularly judgy facial expressions and post them online. So while I was doing this very important preparation for tonight, I came across this piece of art by Brandy Bales, aptly titled Judgmental Chickens. I think they're terrifying. Not cute at all. If you've never felt judged in your life, just sit under their gaze for the next 15 minutes and you just might feel judged. So do not judge. Good luck with that, eh? I had a spiritual director for 9 years in my 20s and early 30s, and bear with me, longer timers have heard this story before. There are different ways to describe spiritual direction, but I'd say it's having someone to accompany you on your spiritual path, helping you to pay attention to where God might be along the way. So I met with my spiritual director for an hour once a month. She patiently helped me work through my issues with God, my issues with my mother, my issues with myself. And at the end of each session, she would typically give me something to think about or practice in the month ahead. So sometimes it was a passage of scripture to meditate on, sometimes it was a prayer practice, and it generally didn't feel like homework in the negative sense of the word. Except for this one time. My spiritual director said, Melanie, for this month, I wonder if you would consider the practice of refraining from judging people, including yourself. And I was offended. How would she have picked up that I'm judgmental? I'm pretty sure I laughed, because it is true. I have given up sugar for a period of time, and that was easier than giving up judgment, which is saying something because I have a sweet tooth. So I gave myself this homework again last weekend. And do you remember what was last weekend? Thanksgiving. So I gave myself this homework on Thanksgiving Sunday at a family gathering. I said to myself, Mel, your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to refrain from judging anyone, including yourself, at this family gathering on this day. Can you guess how well that went? So I actually think I did pretty good until the ride home, when all the internal judgments I had suppressed during the day made their way in a rush from my heart through my mouth and into John's ears. And then again at home as we were getting ready for bed, the poor guy. The gathering was great, and I love my family. And we were in a gorgeous place. We were at my brother's house on the edge of the Pembina Escarpment. We took a beautiful walk through the bush behind their house, and it was so lovely. Most of the trees still had their leaves. So we saw yellows and oranges and greens and red in the bush. It was cool out, but it was bright, and there was hardly any wind. The food was amazing. The turkey and mashed potatoes and gravy and sweet potatoes, my favorite, corn from my uncle's farm, stuffing, cranberry sauce, salad, buns, and my mother's selection of homemade pies, and they need to be eaten in this order: pumpkin, then chocolate, and then apple. The table was decorated with mini pumpkins, and the conversation was, for the most part, positive and encouraging. There was a lot of love to go around. My adult children, who by now have the freedom to skip these gatherings, were there, and they, together with my niece, played a board game with me, which was the highlight of the gathering. We were not grieving the loss of a loved one, and no one was seriously ill. And yet, on the ride home, I was judgy. Do not judge, Jesus says. We've titled this fall teaching series, The Good Life, Lessons from the Sermon on the Mount, because Jesus' teachings in these dense chapters in the book of Matthew really do point to the good life. So we began with the Beatitudes, which is why we're singing them regularly throughout this season. The beauty of being blessed by God, even when we're poor in spirit, even when we're judgy. We've learned what's at the heart of the law, which is love. We've explored what it means to be salt and light in the world. We've been encouraged to give up worry. And tonight we're considering how the good life might also mean letting go of judgment. To me, that feels absolutely impossible. And maybe this is what Jesus meant by the narrow path. It sure isn't the wide, easy path that most of us walk. Judging other people makes us feel better about ourselves. She's the one with the anger issues, not me. He's the gossip, I'm not. They're so judgy, we say, being judgy. Jesus cleverly reveals our tendency to see our own flaws as less of a big deal than other people's. And he says, wait a minute, you think there's just a little dust in your eye? Looks a bit bigger to me. You might want to deal with that. I think tonight's lesson is really hard. Do not judge might be the most ignored of Jesus' teachings. We would rather give away our money. Jesus' followers are known for being judgmental, and I dare say the so-called secular world is better at not judging than we are. And I think that's because when it comes down to it, we still believe in a judgmental God. And because we gather each week to encourage each other to be like God, we get pretty judgy pretty quickly, and we don't feel too bad about it. I know very few people who are not judgmental. But one of my friends seems to be a natural at refraining from judgment, or maybe she's just working hard at it, because whenever I'm beaking off about someone, I'm just processing. No, I'm beaking off about someone. She counters with some ridiculously empathic statement about the victim of my judgment. Maybe they're struggling with this, or maybe they're feeling that. She can see it from their side of things. Maybe they're not quite as evil as I'm imagining. Gracious people. Do not judge, so that you may not be judged. For the judgment you give will be the judgment you get, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. That has been experientially true in my life. When I judge someone, it's not unusual for me to receive a similar judgment at some point down the road. So I judge my mother for worrying too much, and the same could be said about me these days. I judge people with anger issues, and though I may not have road rage, anger is my absolute go-to. Covers everything else, right? I was judgy about the way we did worship at one of the previous churches, and I had the nerve to talk about it with people, saying that it was more about tradition than about Jesus. Can you imagine how that would feel for the worship pastor? Actually, I can imagine that. I can blame it on the idealism of youth, but I knew better. And now the tables have turned, and I'm the pastor, and those pick apart the church conversations are not as fun. It's not an altogether bad thing for judgy people like me to experience what it's like to be judged. Judgment begets judgment, and it lingers like bad gas. This is my favorite part of the sermon, take note. We think we're being discreet. Just hold on to the metaphor. We think we're being subtle. We try to get away with it. We think this isn't going to stink. And it does. You're going to remember this sermon for the rest of your lives because I used such a good metaphor. I had fun. We saw a lot of judgment during COVID, didn't we? And that was when I finally joined Facebook. That was brilliant. I tend to be a late adopter, so skinny jeans were in long before I bought a pair, and as you can see, I have not switched to baggy yet. I still prefer a book in my hand and a newspaper spread out on my kitchen table over ebooks and online news. But I joined Facebook during the pandemic, thinking it would be a way to connect in an isolated time. And I know that it's a lifeline for many people, but it turned out not to be for me. I could not handle the judgment. Sometimes it was explicit. If you don't wear a mask, you don't love people. Really? Sometimes it was implicit. Look at this picture of us obeying the rules. And these were the judgments from the progressive end of the spectrum where I tend to live. But there was plenty of judgment coming from the conservative end too. It was a recipe for relational breakdown. And I sound judgy right now, don't I? It is quite a thing to write a teaching time about not being judgy and then not being judgy in the teaching time. The thing is, we were scared during the pandemic. We were all scared, and we are not at our best when we're afraid. And judgment tends to come out of fear. Doesn't excuse it, but it helps us to understand. So all that said, how do we live without judgment? We make judgments all the time. What's right, what's wrong, how to live a good life. Of course, but that's being judicious. Being judgy is different than being judicious. Being judicious is about discernment, about making wise choices, like wearing a mask during the pandemic, if you ask me. Being judgy is about our place in relation to others, like thinking of ourselves as morally superior to all those people who didn't follow the rules. There will always be people who don't follow the rules, and I hate that. But living judiciously is discerning the good path, the path of love and justice and peace and mercy. Living judgmentally is thinking we're the only ones on the path, so we're definitely better than those people over there. So let's just pull out that Bible verse from childhood, at least from the childhood of some of us. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. I memorized that one many times. Romans 3:23. All of us fall short. As the saying goes, the ground is level at the foot of the cross. Okay, so if all of us fall short, if all of us are broken, we've got to get busy. We've got to be self-aware. We've got to work relentlessly at self-improvement, especially as followers of Jesus. It is probably really important that we judge ourselves. Nope. I watched the movie called Nope. It's terrifying. I don't recommend it. To judge ourselves is to listen to the inner critic that demeans and paralyzes. There's a very big difference between the inner voice of discernment and the inner voice of judgment. Or, put another way, the inner guide and the inner critic. One is God-inspired, and I might argue even God's self, and the other is not. So Jesus uses the word advocate when he describes the Spirit that will come to be with his disciples when he's gone. And that word has also been translated as comforter and helper. The Spirit in us may say something that challenges the way we think and behave, but the Spirit's voice will always sound like an advocate, like someone rooting for us. So I've been watching Ted Lasso. I'm a late adopter. It's been out forever. It's a show about a coach who inspires and motivates his players with love and kindness. He's unorthodox. His coaching comes from a place of friendliness, even when he says things that are hard to hear. And I think the Spirit in us is like that. The Spirit's voice is friendly, even when the Spirit lets us know that we need to change. So compare these two voices. Which one sounds like the advocate? Oh, for crying out loud, why can't you get yourself together? You should know better than by now. Or, Sweetie, you could let this go. It's holding you back. It's hurting the people you love. You want to let it go? We intuitively know the difference between the critic and the guide, between the accuser and the advocate. The Spirit in us will always sound like the guide, not the critic, especially when we're on the wrong track. That old image of a judgmental God just messes us up. God is judge. God is not judgmental. There's a very big difference. God is the one and only judge because God is the one and only being who has all the information. We are simply not up to the task. We don't know how that person over there is built, where they've come from, or what they're going through. Only God knows, and only God has the vision and the grace to judge redemptively. And yes, I say redemptively. When we think of God as judge, it is crucial for us to remember God's character as revealed in the person of Jesus. God is a restorative judge, not a punitive judge. And this is why I'm saying God is not judgmental. Because being judgmental is about being over and against someone else. And Jesus has shown us that that's not God. In Jesus, God came down to be with us, to be for us. And when God hung on the cross, the things God judged there, the things God was over and against, were evil and sin and darkness and death. God rose up over all of that for us and is here now in us as our advocate against the things that threaten to rob us of life, judgment being one of them. Everything God does is redemptive, life-giving, and sustaining. So, well then, we can be like that, right? To follow Jesus is to be a redemptive judge, like God. Maybe to be redemptive people, but the judgment stays with God because it's just too much for us and because Jesus says don't do it. I was reading this recent book by Anne Lamott, one of my favorite writers. It's called Dusk, Night, Dawn. Just reading it today over coffee. She's talking about a sermon she heard about judgment from her pastor. Her pastor said, "How can we live in faithfulness and freedom when we're in judgment? How do we not become part of the problem? To judge is human, and the mystery of faith is that you are forgiven for judging even before you judge. However, the closed heart of judgment destroys your life, so that's not ideal. Focusing intently on what the judged person was doing or not doing only robs us. Obsession robs us of freedom, awareness, and a sense of life's sweetness." So we might speak into each other's lives, but judgment has no place in those conversations because we're not morally superior to anyone else. We're just friends on the path together. And if in those conversations there isn't mutual affection and respect, if there isn't curiosity and a willingness to learn or to be wrong, then it might be best not to have them. It might be like throwing pearls to pigs or letting dogs trample what's holy, as in that strange final verse that Larry read tonight. And from another angle, if in our most tender and vulnerable moments we let someone into our struggle who's more accuser than advocate, we might regret it. So I've been on both ends of that spectrum. I've shared vulnerabilities with people who've been more accuser than advocate, and I've regretted it. And I've also been to others more accuser than advocate and regretted that too. Humans are judgy, but we're working on it, right? The times that I've been able to let go of judgment are the times I've experienced what Jesus said about his yoke being easy and his burden being light. Because there's the paradox. One of the most difficult of Jesus' teachings, do not judge, is what makes life easiest. Because we've laid down the burden of being the morality police. The good life in the Sermon on the Mount is so much letting go, so much about letting go. Letting go of the idea that you have to have it all together to be blessed by God. Letting go of a righteousness that looks more like legalism than love. Letting go of the need to look good in front of others. Letting go of worry. Letting go of the pursuit of wealth. And now letting go of judgment. So thankfully, the Holy Advocate lives in us and helps us to release our grip. And thankfully, we've got a community of friends who walk with us and remind us not to be afraid. And thankfully, we do not live under the gaze of a judgmental God, and we don't have to be like those judgmental chickens. Screen to black. Amen.